War II affect white working class males in New Orleans and the surrounding area?
In quite a few different ways. It is important to think about race in this context because the war industries in the city had a character that you could define in terms of how their hiring was based on race, because the federal policy in the defense industry in the South was to hire whites only. The idea was that in this way they could maintain full employment and production. So for white working class males, there was plenty of opportunity. They could go to public training programs and learn skilled trades like welding so that they could work in the industry, and yet those programs were only available to the local white males. Later on, white women were also trained, but for their black counterparts, it was a much different story. So there was plenty of opportunity. In the case of rural Louisianians in southern Louisiana, they migrated into the cities, faced housing shortages, but they could have all the skilled work that they wanted, as well as free training to get it. So for sharecroppers and others outside the city during the war, they had money in their pockets for the first time. And that was a tremendous change. For others, the defense industry consisted of new opportunities in places like Higgins Industries on the lake shore and the other plants that developed around shipbuilding in the area. We were one of the top areas for defense production, and particularly shipbuilding. It was an opportunity to contribute to the patriotism and the cause of the war. And then, of course, there were plenty of people who went overseas, and that was another experience altogether.
Okay. How about how war affected white working class females in New Orleans?
Well, for them, the challenge was twofold, in that since there was so much opportunity for men, and so many men also went to war and therefore left the region, they had to maintain the home front. And later in the war, in 43 and increasingly so in 44 and 45, they went into the factories as well. So the experience was much different. Now, in the case of the women, the opportunity was there while the demand existed during the war, but then once the war ended, seniority kicked in the factories, so they had to retreat, if you will, from the workplace and return to the home, which was difficult for a lot of women because they enjoyed the freedom and the opportunity that came with having a paycheck and independence and working outside the home.
Okay. So we had lots of Rosies.
There were, yes, yes.
Okay. There's a pattern here. How did World War II affect black working class males in New Orleans and the surrounding area?
For them, there was still more opportunity than prior to American entry into the war. Excuse me. So there were a lot of openings that developed in industries that were not linked to defense production. So wages went up because of the demand. We had a labor shortage, which meant that black people found jobs in areas where they were competing with lesser paid whites previously. So there were a lot of openings available. But if they were skilled workers or involved in industry in any way, and they wanted to continue those roles, then they had two problems. The first one was the attitude of the unions, which continued to reject skilled black workers, and therefore they were excluded from the workplace on that basis, since so many of the craft unions dominated, for example, the shipyards in the area. And so you couldn't be you couldn't get work in the shipyards if you weren't a member of the Boilermakers, for example. The Boilermakers is an example of one union that did develop a black auxiliary. So there was some opportunity there, but again, the policy was not to hire black workers because the federal agents who handled war mobilization were deeply concerned about race rioting and racial conflict, again, breaking down full production. So the figures are actually that while 120,000 some white workers migrated into the area to take up new opportunities, 40,000 black workers had to leave. And oftentimes the federal government or their employers would pay for them to migrate to places like Chicago, out west, Oakland. So a lot of black workers found themselves departing the region altogether and entering what I call the Louisiana diaspora, because they really were forced to leave in search of work. And a lot of them never returned. So they found opportunity outside the region.
Did this apply to black females as well?
Well, yes, to the extent that the racial distinctions continued to function, the black females were no more welcome in the workplace than their male counterparts. Later in the war, 44, 45, they found some opportunity along with white women. Now, I should say the single exception to this was Higgins Industries, which of course is where the famous PT boats were constructed. When Andrew Higgins set up his factories in 1943, he decided to do something no other Southern industrialists were doing, and that was to hire on an equal basis, male, female, white, black, and he set up segregated assembly lines, so there wasn't integration. But in the case of Higgins, you did get a opportunity for limited numbers of black workers, both male and female.
And presumably a lot of black females in New Orleans continued to work as domestics?
Correct. There were some, I think the figure is 20,000 domestics employed in the city in 1940. That's women working in the homes of primarily other women, white women, who were their direct employers, the housewives, if you will. They also worked in the laundry industry. They worked in food preparation, meaning the manufacturing, food canning and the like. They too encountered more opportunity because of the labor demand.
Okay. And finally, how did World War II affect labor unions in New Orleans?
It was a great boom for the labor unions, because with the New Deal legislation in place that had created the National Labor Relations Board, industry had to use unionized labor in all cases, which meant in those industries where unions like the Boilermakers already held contracts prior to the war, those unions ballooned with the rest of the industries that came up from nothing after 1941. And so the unions affiliated with the American Federation of Labor tripled and then tripled again in terms of numbers. And the smaller unions, which were more radical but represented a wider spread of skills and different kinds of workers in industries like the laundry industry, the warehouse industries, those unions also exploded in numbers. It wasn't as large in terms of the end result, but proportionately, all the unions grew very rapidly.
You've done some work on both black and white teachers in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
How were they affected by the war?
Well, they were getting paid, finally. Particularly the black teachers during the Depression found their paychecks disappear in terms of they were paid in promissory notes during the Depression, or their pay was cut so low that it was almost insignificant, and that was true to some extent of white teachers as well. But then during the war, there was money available. The demand increased. A lot of male teachers left teaching and either went into the services or the local industries. And so there were more openings for women teachers. At the same time, a lot of the teachers wanted to work in the defense industries on a part-time basis, and they had a real problem battling the school board and some local principals over the question of whether or not they were capable of performing two different responsibilities at once. And so the war contributed some to the two unions that existed at the time, the American Federation of Teachers locals. It represented both. There was a union for white teachers and a union for black teachers, and those unions helped in terms of fighting the case of the teachers with the school board so that they could contribute to the patriotic cause and go into the factories and work in addition to teaching in the classroom during the day.
How would that work? Would they do a shift during the week in addition to teaching, or was this something mostly on weekends in the summer?
It was both. It was primarily night shifts, and there was some staggering of students that happened on various occasions in terms of the nature of the demand for labor. However, it was primarily night shifts. They would work a night shift in a factory and then teach during the day.
It's been exhausting.
Yeah, they were exhausted.
All right. Well, that covers what I needed to cover. So
Okay.
we're good.